Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Magnus.
Good morning. Welcome to In the Word, a ministry of Christian education sponsored by First Christian Church in Johnson City. We're so glad that you could join us again for another study in God's Word. We're actually finishing a season of study today. We've been focusing on a wonderfully important topic, acknowledging God. And we've discussed a number of themes under that heading. We've talked about the oneness of God, which is emphasized both in the Old Testament and in the teaching of Jesus. We've talked about the importance of worshiping God and obeying God, and how our generosity is actually a gift to God. So now we've come to the end of this, and we end with two beautiful passages. One from Psalms, kind of the worship hymnal of the ancient Israelite people, focused a lot on praise of God. And then a short passage from Hebrews, which is a very, very powerful book in the New Testament about what God has done for us through Jesus Christ. So welcome. We're glad you're here. Welcome to you, David.
Good to be back again.
Glad that we get to explore this passage together again. And so here we're jumping to the Psalms all of a sudden.
We're in the hymnal.
Yes. A great hymnal it was. And, you know, in the early church, it says music was a very important part of their worship. Mm-hmm. And they sang psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So a major part of the hymnody, of the worship music of the early church was straight out of this book of Psalms.
And the book of Psalms is so much like a hymnal in that it's got such a variety of types of music or poetry in it. And as you were saying, the psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs mentioned in the New Testament, in a way, it's sad that some churches focus entirely on hymns, and some churches entirely on spiritual songs.
Right.
And the mix is good. And Psalms has a mix.
It does. It does. It has hymns, is one of the things. Songs of praise.
Songs of lament.
Yeah, just people poets pouring their heart out to God. And I think it's partly for that reason that the Psalms have continued to be such a powerful devotional magnet for Christian believers as well.
They speak to so much of life because they're expressive of.
They speak to our joy in the Lord. They speak to our suffering and sense of loss and abandonment.
But through it all, as our quarter is acknowledging God, that's what Psalms are doing.
Right. And even the lament Psalms, the Psalms of mourning, always shift to an expression of their trust in God, even in the midst of life's difficult circumstances. Now you mentioned that this is poetry. It's like lyrics. If, you know, some folks we worship sometimes at a church where the singing is done by looking at the words on a screen. And that's kind of what we have here. It's just the words.
Just the words,
We don't have the musical notation like you would in a traditional hymn book. So we have the lyrics, the poetic lyrics of these great worship songs. And they are poetic. In fact, there are a couple of poetic features of Psalm 34 that we might mention. One is that it's an alphabetic acrostic.
Right. 22 verses.
You want to explain to people what that means?
There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and when you find a psalm like this with 22 verses, it's quite often where each separate verse begins with a letter of the alphabet.
So the first word in each successive verse begins with the succeeding letter of the alphabet.
And the prime example is Psalm 119, which is 176 verses in 8 verse stanzas, and each of those stanzas, the 22 stanzas, again, they're acrostics.
Yeah. So it'd be like if you had a long poem, and the first 8 lines of the poem all began with a word beginning with an A, and then the next 8 all began with B, right? Yeah. So it's a very unusual construction, but there are a number of psalms that are like that. Psalm 9, Psalm 10, and well, you mentioned Psalm 119, which is the main one. So, yeah, sometimes there are 66 verses.
Right. Variation
so that's 3 times 22. The other poetic feature that I find very important is this matter of parallelism. It's where, I'm sure people have noticed in the Old Testament poetry, the poetry comes in 2-line couplets. There are 2 lines, then another 2 lines. And those 2 lines are in parallel with each other. Help us with how we could read there.
Many times the parallelism is synonymous. It's saying the same thing in different words, and it's repeating the idea to emphasize it, but using different words and yet trying to get the same idea across 2 times.
Right.
Sometimes it's what's called antithetical, where the first line says one thing and the other flips it around to say the opposite, but the truth is there in both.
Yeah.
Like a wise son is a joy to his father, a foolish son is a pain to his mother.
Yeah.
Well, you see that.
And the second line there frequently begins with the word but, which is kind of a clue that you've got the contrast.
It really shows up in Proverbs. There are a lot of Proverbs that are antithetical.
But so that's pretty common. And then the first one you mentioned, where the lines just say pretty much the same sentiment, but in slightly different words.
Yeah.
And when we read our from Psalm 34 today, we're going to see a number of examples of that.
There's a third type that's not as common or as easily recognizable, sometimes called a step parallelism or progressive parallelism, where it builds one idea upon another.
The second line is kind of the result of the first line, or an implication from the first line. So this was all done very carefully and very deliberately. It's just that we don't always notice it.
We think of rhymes in poetry, but for Hebrews it was a couplet.
Yeah, so it's kind of a rhyming of ideas rather than the sound of a rhyme. One last thing about Psalm 34 before we read from it. Psalm 34 is a mixture of types, or a mixture of ideas, which is a little unusual.
It is.
Usually you have a psalm of praise or a psalm of thanks or whatever, and this is kind of a mixture, isn't it?
The first 10 verses we'll be looking at, that's our text for the lesson, but verses 11 and following are really more wisdom literature.
They sound more like something from Ecclesiastes or Proverbs, where it's very instruction oriented. The first 10 verses combine 2 related ideas of praise to God and an expression of trust in God, which are somewhat related. So, well, that's Psalm 34. We will tack on a quick word about the Hebrews passage later, but maybe we should first look at Psalm 34. Oh, before I read it, many of our viewers will be looking at Bibles which have a little heading.
Right.
Do you want to, because that's not in our printed text.
Right, it's not in the printed text, and the Hebrew people themselves did not consider those little superscriptions at the beginning of Psalms to be a part of the inspired text. And most scholars think that they were probably added several centuries after the Psalms were written. They can be helpful in a perception of a historical incident to see that psalm and see how it would apply. Whether it actually is locked into that situation or not is debatable, maybe and maybe not. We just don't know. As quite often they'll say a Psalm of David, And we end up saying David wrote all the Psalms. Well, some of them talk about the temple, talk about different things that were obviously after his time, and yet they're titled a Psalm of David. And most scholars see that as something that could be by David or for David
Dedicated
or like
to
David. But it's a connection, but maybe not written by him. We just don't know.
The one that's attached to this psalm mentions him fleeing King Saul and hiding out and,
among the Philistines.
And nervous about what the Philistine king is going to do. And so he feigned madness. He pretended to be insane. So some people will make a big deal about connecting the words of the psalm to that event from David's life. We're probably not going to put the emphasis there, but I just thought we should at least refer to it, because many people's Bibles will have those words there.
And it may have been, we just don't know.
Yeah. All right, well, let me read the first 10 verses of Psalm 34. I will extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. I will glory in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. This poor man called, and the Lord heard him. He saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Fear the Lord, you his holy people, for those who fear him lack nothing. The lions may grow weak and hungry, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing.
That's a great passage.
It is just a beautiful, beautiful passage. Well, in verse 1, we have a perfect example of this concept, the poetic technique of parallelism that we were talking about just a few minutes ago. I will extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. So the parallels there are extol and praise, which are virtually the same thing. There's two different words, but they mean pretty much the same thing. And then we get at all times and always. So this is a good example of that kind of parallelism where the two lines of poetry are saying the very same sentiment, but in slightly different words.
To emphasize.
So we don't need to think about, now what did the psalmist mean by extol, and how's that different from praise? We don't have to waste our time doing that. They're meant to be two expressions of this. Yeah, they are. Yeah. Well, having said that, I think this idea of praise then and worship is central right from the get-go here, and it's going to be important all the way through here. And it makes this a fitting conclusion to this quarter's emphasis on acknowledging God, where we end with the praise and glory and exaltation of God.
That second verse, I'll glory in the Lord, let the afflicted hear and rejoice. You want to comment about the afflicted?
Yeah, I do, and I think it's closely related to the phrase at all times back in verse 1. At all times doesn't mean that we are actually actively involved in praise every second of every day, but that we would give praise to God in all circumstances of life. I think, when we got married back in the old days to our wives, we were still using fairly traditional promises, weren't we? Sometimes people write their own vows nowadays, don't they? You never know what you're going to get. But part of the traditional wedding vows are in prosperity and adversity. And that's the idea here when we say, I extol the Lord at all times, in all circumstances, when everything's going well or when we're in deep suffering. And that brings us to that word you referred to in verse 2. Let even those who are afflicted need to hear and rejoice in the midst of their affliction.
Right.
Yeah. But the word afflicted, which at first glance might make it sound like someone who's diseased or being persecuted or whatever, is a Hebrew word that simply means lowly or needy. So the affliction that's talked about here is not some extraordinary moment of persecution, but just kind of the daily challenges and needs of life.
People who are troubled or having a tough time, whatever it may be.
Needy in whatever way.
But you can still glory in the Lord.
Yeah.
And that's the important thing.
Now, in verse 3, when it says, exalt his name forever, does that mean we need to have some kind of special reverence to the word G-O-D or something like that?
When I was a high schooler, I had a lady, my mother was sick, and I had a lady clean our house, and she started telling me that if you're not baptized in the name of Jesus, J-E-S-U-S, it doesn't take. And it really spooked me. I never heard that before.
As if there was some magical...
Yes, the name.
Yeah, like it was abracadabra or something.
And then our minister pointed out that that's an English word.
Yeah.
And so even if you're talking about the New Testament, they weren't using that English word.
Exactly.
And the concept of name is not just an alphabetic title. It's the character of the person. It's the reality of who the person is. And so when you're exalting his name, you're really worshiping God because he's God.
Right, yeah. And not that we think there's no problem with taking the Lord's name in vain or something like that, but the focus must be on the person of God and the character of God, and that's what we're exalting, not just his title, but his person. Okay, that's a good explanation. Well, these next few verses shift from pure praise and worship to more an expression of trust. You know, these words remind me a lot of the psalm found in the 2nd chapter of Jonah.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
When he was in the midst of the great fish, and he was drowning in despair.
Yes, he calls out to the Lord, he seeks the Lord, and the Lord answers him. And it closes that beautiful, it's a psalm right there in the middle of the book of Jonah. And it ends with deliverance belongs to the Lord.
Right.
And that's the sentiment here in verse 4. He delivered me from all my fears. Now, is fear a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it depends on how it's used. Here, it's the things that come along that may scare us, but further on in the psalm, the word fear is used several times, talking about the fear of the Lord, which is good.
Yeah. The word actually appears 4 times, I think it is, in this passage. And the first time, fears, the things that scare us, things that go bump in the night. But then the other references in verses 7 and 9 are to the fear of the Lord. Right. And that's a very positive concept of reverence.
Reverence and worship.
Worship,
Recognition of his. But
so,
the emphasis in verse 5, those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. That's a picturesque idea to consider the glow of a person who's really turned on to the Lord.
Yeah, I can't think of a parallel to that concept. Moses had to wear a veil when he came down off Mount Sinai because his face was glowing, shining with the glory of God. I don't know if there's a parallel there or not.
But I've heard people say that someone who's a really devout Christian, a genuine Christian, there just seems to be a glow about them.
A glow, yeah.
So
Now, verse 6 is interesting because it gets very specific all of a sudden and says, this poor man called, and the Lord heard him. That reference to a poor man harkens back to verse 2, that word afflicted that you pointed out, where it refers to someone who is poor or in need. And here it's being used in the singular. Some people do think that that's the psalmist, David, referring to himself, kind of way of saying, I really needed the Lord, and I called out to Him, and the Lord heard me. Then a synonym to the word delivered is this word saved here. The word troubles at the end of verse 6 is literally the word adversaries, kind of like enemies.
Yeah.
So that's the first of several kind of military terms.
It really shows up in the next verse. Verse
Yeah,
7.
right.
The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him.
Yeah, it's kind of like a military bivouac or something like that, a military encampment. And then delivery is also a military term referring to rescue. Yeah. I can't read that word encampment without thinking about the beautiful metaphor that's used in the Gospel of John in the New Testament, where it begins, in the beginning was the Word and all that. And then in verse 14, and the Word became flesh, and most English translations say dwelled among us or dwelt among us. But the literal meaning of that word dwelt is pitched his tent.
Right, he
among
tabernacled.
us. He tabernacled among us.
Yeah.
And here we get the idea of a kind of a tenting, a camping, a pitching a tent. The angel of the Lord is an interesting phrase that kind of comes out of nowhere here. It may well refer to a protective angel.
Guardian angel.
A guardian angel. Angels sometimes had a protective role, often a messenger role. Sometimes, though, angels are referred to as a way of talking about the presence of God himself, like with Jacob and the wrestling. That it says he's wrestling with an angel, but then it sounds like it's actually the presence of God, right? Yeah.
And Abraham, when he was confronted about Sodom and Gomorrah, messengers, and yet it was God talking.
Right. So this may suggest that God is encamped around those who fear him, those who worship him. In other words, God's presence is there as a protection for those who acknowledge God.
Yeah.
What about the lions in verse 10?
It may be just talking the wild animals, the young lions, the king of the beast. They can do anything, but even they get hungry sometimes. But it may not be just animals.
Yeah, I was fascinated. The Hebrew Old Testament, that is the Old Testament written in the Hebrew language, was then translated into Greek during the time when the Greek language dominated the Mediterranean world, about 200 years before Jesus coming. And when those Jewish rabbis translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, they translated this word lions, the rich, meaning the rich and powerful. And so the idea is that those who are materially in control in their lives and powerful and rich, even they get weak from time to time, but not those who put their trust in the Lord.
Yeah.
So it's more important to put your trust in the Lord than to put your trust in wealth.
Right.
Yeah. All right, let's jump to Hebrews here.
Okay.
We're in Hebrews chapter 2. Set the context for us.
The verses we've got, just verses 17 and 18, really need the context setting, because in the book of Hebrews, we don't know who wrote the book, but it was someone concerned about Jewish Christians who were now inclined to give up their faith in Christ and go back into Judaism and simply be Jews. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, don't you realize what you're giving up? That you just can't do that.
Yeah.
And in chapter 2, there's the emphasis where the quotation is brought out from the Old Testament, from Psalm 8, how God has made us a little lower than the angels and so forth, and that one is coming and put everything under his feet. But then following that, the writer goes on to say, in putting everything under him, God left nothing that's not subject to him. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to him, but we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. In bringing many sons to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. That emphasis is given to us that Jesus is Lord and Jesus is over all, and we see that because he suffered and died.
Exactly. The glory and the suffering are linked together. And that is the context, thank you, of these two verses in our printed text, verses 17 and 18 from Hebrews 2. For this reason, he, Jesus, had to be made like them, that is, like human beings, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. So this is a beautiful passage about how Jesus is glorified and yet lowered in the incarnation, that is, in his humanity. And the reason for that was not only so that he could live among us and communicate with us on our level, but also so he could share human sufferings.
He can identify with what we're going through. He has been there.
And that's what makes him the great high priest, more important and more effective than any high priest that the Jews ever had.
And more than angels.
And even more than angels, What we see here, I think, is such a beautiful picture of the centrality of Jesus Christ. On the one hand, he is like God. The way he's described here in verse 17 is as the merciful and faithful high priest. These are two very important phrases from the Old Testament, words from the Old Testament that describe God. You know, back in Psalm 34, verse 8 said, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." And the question becomes, how can we experience the goodness of God? How in the world can we do that? And Hebrews actually gives us the answer. Keep your eyes focused on Jesus. That's where you'll see the goodness of God, the mercy of God, the faithfulness of God. And then we see that that Jesus is not only the priest, he also becomes the sacrifice.
Right.
With this idea of atonement, right?
Yeah. And where Psalm 34 talks about in every circumstance of life we found faithfulness in God, in Jesus we see that.
Yeah. Because his faithfulness to God was lived out most dramatically in his suffering and death. And that's what the author of Hebrews comes back to over and over again and says, nothing compares to Jesus at that point. So we have a wonderful focus on the cross. So not only is Jesus like God in his goodness and mercy and kindness and faithfulness, he's like us in that he too experienced the human condition, human joy, human suffering,
and even death.
And even human death. Well, we're glad to have been able to explore the Old Testament a little bit, but to come around to Jesus and the centrality of Jesus Christ in our lives. We're glad you could join us and be with us for this study. Hope you can join us again next week as we begin a new series and a new focus. God be with you.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.